The people who lived the longest in recorded history were not eating well, they were eating what was left after a kingdom was taxed into starvation. Picture an island chain south of Japan, where elders still tend gardens well past their 100th birthday. Documentary crews arrived expecting abundance, fresh fish markets, and generations feasting on the sea. What they found instead was a population that had survived on almost nothing for nearly 3 centuries. In 1609, a rival clan invaded the Ryukyu Kingdom and seized control of its trade and its taxes. Foreign trade profits that once fed the islands were redirected north, leaving local farmers with almost nothing. Heavy tribute payments followed, pushing entire villages into a poverty that outlasted generations. Before that invasion, repeated crop failures had already caused famines that left islanders with empty storehouses. Grain simply would not grow reliably on volcanic, salt-sprayed soil, battered by typhoons every season. Researchers who studied mid-century food records found something nobody expected from a so-called healthy diet. The traditional plate was almost entirely plant-based, close to 96% of every meal eaten. Fish, the food everyone assumes fueled these long lives, made up less than 1% of daily intake. Meat appeared even less often, also under 1%, a rounding error rather than a dietary staple. Eggs and dairy combined accounted for less than 1% as well, nearly absent from the table. This was not a curated menu of superfoods, it was the leftover diet of a population with almost no options. Nearly every calorie on that 96% plant-based plate traced back to a single root vegetable. One crop, one grown in small garden plots, was doing the work an entire food system normally handles. That crop was not native to Japan, China, or anywhere near the Ryukyu Kingdom at all. It had crossed oceans, continents, and empires before a single islander ever tasted it. To understand how a population survived on one plant, the story has to start on the other side of the world. The plant that saved a starving kingdom began as a staple crop cultivated by Aztec farmers in the Americas. The Spanish traders carried it across the Pacific to the Philippines sometime in the 1500s.
Hi there, we're introducing...
Colonial authorities in the Philippines banned its export, trying to keep the crop under their own control. Traders smuggled it out anyway, and by the 1590s, it had reached the coast of southern China. A low-ranking Ryukyu government clerk was stationed at a trading post in Fuzhou, in Fujian province. His job involved studying Chinese agricultural texts while managing tribute shipments back to the islands. Among those texts, he found descriptions of a hardy tuber that thrived in poor, storm-battered soil. He requested cuttings, packed them in pots, and carried them home across open water around 1605. That act placed the crop on Ryukyu soil just 4 years before the invasion that crushed the kingdom. A royal court official tested the plant in local gardens before encouraging farmers to plant it widely. The timing mattered enormously, since the invasion of 1609 soon stripped away trade income. With foreign profits gone and taxes rising, families needed a crop that required almost no investment. The tuber demanded no elaborate irrigation, no imported fertilizer, and no specialized farming knowledge. It also survived typhoons that regularly destroyed grain fields across the island chain each autumn. Within a few decades, the crop had spread village to village as the only reliable source of calories. By the 1700s, it had even reached Japan's Satsuma region, prized as a famine relief crop. In the Ryukyu Kingdom itself, it was not a supplement to the diet, it effectively became the diet. A vegetable born from Aztec fields and smuggled past a colonial export ban was now feeding a population. Historians studying the period note that without this crop, a severe scarcity was almost certain. The very poverty caused by conquest is what forced total dependence on this one imported tuber. Sweet, purple-fleshed, and stubbornly hardy, it became the backbone of the traditional Okinawan table. But feeding a population is different from keeping that population alive for a century or more. Simply surviving on one crop does not explain why so many islanders lived past their 100th birthday. The answer was not hidden in the crop itself, but in how little of it people allowed themselves to eat. What looked like nutritional wisdom was, in practice, a form of hunger that never fully went away. Nutrition researchers who examined Okinawan food logs from before 1960 found a strange pattern. Islanders were consuming roughly 10 to 15% fewer calories than standard guidelines required. This was not an occasional fast or seasonal shortage. It was a lifelong, daily caloric deficit. A saying passed down through generations instructed people to stop eating at 80% full. Meals ended deliberately before the stomach felt satisfied, a habit repeated at every single sitting. This was not a modern diet trend borrowed from a wellness magazine. It was a survival habit centuries old. This was not a modern diet trend borrowed from a wellness magazine. It was a survival habit centuries old. Families with barely enough food had little choice but to ration portions long before science explained why. What began as necessity eventually hardened into cultural practice, taught to children as simple manners. Scientists studying aging populations later linked sustained calorie restriction to slower cellular aging. Cells under mild, chronic stress activate repair processes largely dormant during periods of abundance. Laboratory studies on other species had already shown restricted diets could extend measurable lifespan. Okinawa offered something laboratories could not: a human population living this pattern for generations. Unlike a controlled experiment, nobody on these islands chose restriction as a deliberate health strategy. Poverty had already been rationing their plates since the early 1600s, decades before study began. The sweet potato made this survivable calorie deficit possible without collapsing into outright starvation. Its high water content and moderate calorie density let people eat until full without overloading on energy. A large portion of sweet potato filled the stomach while keeping total daily calories relatively low. This combination, forced scarcity paired with a filling, low-density staple crop, was almost accidental. No nutritionist designed this system. It emerged from centuries of conquest, taxation, and repeated famine. Yet by the 20th century, researchers were measuring outcomes that looked deliberately engineered. Elderly islanders were reaching their 90s and 100s at rates unmatched almost anywhere on record. International demographers began traveling to the region specifically to document how common this was. A long-running study on aging there eventually became the longest ongoing centenarian study in the world. Its researchers wanted one basic question answered: was this pattern of eating actually driving longevity? Early data suggested a connection too strong to dismiss as coincidence or simple genetics. But a body running on a permanent calorie deficit does not get every benefit without some kind of cost. Extreme, sustained restriction almost always leaves a mark somewhere in the body, even a healthy-looking one. The next question researchers had to answer was whether this so-called healthy diet was free of downsides. What they eventually found complicated the tidy, feel-good version of the Okinawa story completely. By 1995, researchers comparing Okinawan and American death records found numbers hard to believe. An average person on the islands was roughly 8 times less likely to die from coronary artery disease. Prostate cancer deaths were about 7 times lower among Okinawan men than among American men the same age. Breast cancer mortality sat at roughly 6.5 times lower than the equivalent American rate. Colon cancer deaths were about 2.5 times lower, another gap far too large to be random chance. These were not small statistical differences. They represented some of the widest health gaps ever recorded. International research teams began publishing papers trying to explain exactly what was happening. Diet, and specifically the near total absence of processed food, kept appearing as the leading explanation. The sweet potato-based, plant-heavy, calorie-restricted pattern seemed to be doing something protective. Would you accept chronic vitamin deficiency and delayed puberty in exchange for an 8 times lower heart disease risk? For a moment, this looked like the clean, uplifting health story every documentary wants to tell. But the same researchers digging into these numbers also found signs the diet carried real costs. More than 10% of the population showed signs of vitamin B2 deficiency on the lips and mouth. That condition, called chelosis, results directly from chronically low intake of animal and dairy products. Just over 9% of women in these studies reported delayed onset of menstruation during adolescence. Nearly 18% reported difficulty securing enough nourishment to sustain the most vulnerable. Both patterns point to the same cause: bodies running for years on too few calories and too little fat. This was not a diet engineered for optimal health. It was a body's adaptation to chronic, forced scarcity. The same restriction that seemed to protect the heart was also quietly straining reproductive health. Longevity researchers now describe this as a trade-off rather than a miracle. Benefits paired with costs. Living past 100 did not mean living without physical strain along the way to get there. Still, by any measurable standard, something about this pattern was keeping death rates dramatically lower. For decades, this advantage held steady, generation after generation, seemingly immune to changing times. Then, starting around 1960, something happened that no eating habit could protect against. The very poverty that had created this unusual diet was about to disappear, and so was its advantage. What replaced scarcity would undo in a few decades what conquest and famine had shaped over 3 centuries. After World War II ended, the islands fell under American military administration for more than 2 decades. Economic conditions slowly improved, and by 1960, average household income began rising steadily. As administrative control loosened, trade restrictions loosened with it, opening the islands to new imports. American food companies began shipping processed products into local markets on a scale never seen before. Canned meat, refined flour, and sugary snacks appeared on shelves that had almost never carried them. These products were calorie-dense, in a way the traditional sweet potato-based diet had never been. For a population whose bodies had adapted to scarcity, sudden abundance landed very differently than expected. Schools began distributing American-style lunchboxes filled with bread, processed meat, and sweetened milk. Children raised on these lunches consumed far more calories daily than their grandparents ever had. Within a single generation, portion sizes and eating habits shifted more than they had in 3 centuries. Cars replaced walking as the primary way people moved around the islands, cutting daily activity sharply. The traditional garden plots that once grew sweet potatoes were slowly replaced by convenience stores. By the 1980s, doctors were reporting obesity rates climbing faster than anywhere else in Japan. The same population once studied for extraordinary heart health was now developing new cases of heart disease. Diabetes diagnoses, once rare enough to barely register in local health records, began rising sharply. Researchers who had documented the earlier advantage now had to document its unraveling in real time. Life expectancy on the islands had led every prefecture in Japan for decades without serious competition. Starting after 1985, that lead began narrowing year after year in the national statistics. By the early 2000s, the islands had lost their top ranking entirely, falling toward the national average. For men specifically, the ranking collapse was severe enough to alarm public health officials nationwide. Obesity became the single most serious public health problem among women living on the islands. The very body composition that once made these communities a global research subject had reversed. Grandparents who grew up eating almost nothing but sweet potatoes watched grandchildren develop conditions their own generation had rarely known. That reversal proved something researchers had suspected but rarely gotten to observe so clearly. Diet was the cause. If abundance alone had destroyed the advantage, then scarcity itself must have been the actual mechanism. This meant the traditional diet was never a formula to copy freely. It was a specific historical condition. Remove the poverty, remove the imported tuber, remove the restriction, and the longevity advantage disappears too. That is a much harder story to sell than a simple list of superfoods. But it fits the actual evidence. Yet even this explanation leaves one nagging question researchers have only recently started to confront. Were the original numbers, the record-breaking counts of centenarians, ever fully accurate to begin with? During the Battle of Okinawa in 1945, ground combat destroyed much of the region's infrastructure. Town halls, temple registries, and family record books were burned, buried, or simply lost in the chaos. Birth certificates that would normally verify a person's exact age were among the documents destroyed. Demographers researching the islands decades later realized many centenarian claims relied on incomplete paperwork. Without original birth records, some ages were reconstructed from memory, family testimony, or temple lists. A researcher who spent years validating these claims found the vast majority held up under scrutiny. Still, an unknown share of the original count likely reflected genuine uncertainty rather than confirmed fact. This does not erase the island's longevity advantage, but it complicates the cleanest version of the legend. Part of what made this population famous may be equal parts real biology and wartime record-keeping gaps. The honest answer is that nobody chose this diet. Poverty and one smuggled tuber chose it for them. Their restraint at the table was rationing, not wisdom, and it worked because they had no alternative. When conquest ended and imported abundance arrived after 1960, that advantage collapsed within one generation. Even the exact number of centenarians stays uncertain, since wartime fires destroyed the records that would prove it. So would you trade convenience and abundance for 3 extra decades of life, if scarcity was the actual price? There is no easy answer, and this island chain proves nobody has fully solved that trade-off yet. If this changed how you think about what healthy eating actually means, hit like on this video right now. Drop a comment below with the one food myth from your own country you want this channel to investigate next. If hidden history behind everyday food keeps you curious, you are exactly the viewer this channel was built for. Every video here traces the real chain of events behind a food myth, exactly the way this one just did. New episodes uncover a different forgotten diet, a different disappearing empire, every single week on this channel. Subscribe now so the next island, the next crop, and the next hidden collapse do not pass you by. Because the story behind what you eat is rarely the one you were told, and that story is always worth uncovering. Welcome. Today, we delve into the secrets held within this ancient text. Fascinating. Just as I suspected.